It's been a while since I read something that made me so angry that I wanted to talk about it right here and now. I bought the new and revised edition of Matthew Lewis's The Survival of the Princes in the Tower. The original is from 2017. This one is from last year. And boy, is it willingly bad. The concept of the book is simple. Lewis, chairman of the Richard III Society, presents several theories about the prince's survival. They are conflicting with each other, which isn't a problem, since the whole point of the book is to prove that their murder is not as clear-cut as tradition wants us to believe. Fine. One chapter named A King in Dublin deals with the idea that Lambert Simnel was actually Edward V, the real Edward Plantagenet, son of George, Duke of Clarence, or an illegitimate son of Edward IV. And to Lewis's credit, he tries to name some counter-arguments, such as Sir Edward Woodville fighting against the invasion force, just to backpedal a little later by saying that maybe he was not participating in the actual fighting. The way Lewis presents his thoughts is problematic. Let's start with Simnel being Edward V. You might expect that the invasion force had announced left and right that they had Edward VI with them, but nothing of that kind survived. Lewis has an answer. Henry VII was interested in destroying this evidence. But, in this very chapter, Lewis cites a letter in full from the king leading the invasion force that was received in York. You would accept at least a reference to his father Edward IV if this boy was really Edward V. You might argue that the hint was destroyed by the Tudors. Fine. Then you might expect a hint to George, Duke of Clarence, since it was the official version of the Tudor kings that the pretender impersonated his son Edward. This is missing as well. Lewis continues that the York House book reports the letter writer calls himself King Edward VI I, which would mean he is the son of George, but the York civic records speak of Edward V. The problem is, a few pages earlier in this chapter, Lewis quotes the York civic records naming him King Edward VI. He calls it the solitary contemporary record. How does this fit together with what he says later on? Lewis suspects that the reference to Edward VI in the York civic record was doctored. It was later falsified to say sixth, and from here on, he just goes with it as a fact. You can't do that. Lewis offers us a letter that doesn't give us any information whatsoever about the background about the Edward that we know as Lambert Simnel, and official records that say Edward VI. To bolster his theory that it might have been Edward V, Lewis talks about John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, who joined the invasion force, the highest-ranking Yorkist heir known to be definitely alive. He assumes that Lincoln could only have done so when he was sure said Simnel was indeed Edward V. Why should he take second place for an impostor, especially since he and his family were accepted by the Tudors and he had a lot to lose? Did he so? Lewis himself offers possible alternatives. At least there was the chance for him to become the heir to the impostor Edward. Lewis complains that the background of Simnel seems far more uncertain than it should have been. The whole persona might have been fabricated. Let's say he was an impostor. His handlers might have had an interest to find someone nobody would know and recognize. By the way, Lewis never talks about the elephant in the room. A lot of people knew how Edward V looked like. He was travelling through the whole country and was greeted by thousands of people in London in May 1483. The first 4 weeks during his reign in 1483, he signed documents as king. He had his own council for Wales before he became king. Nobles could have identified him pretty easily. The age of Simnel doesn't fit as well. Simnel was around 10 years old, according to the Parliament rolls of November 1487. Edward V would have been 16. Lewis has a solution. He cites Bacon, writing over a century later, that the boy was around 15, plucking it back to a source from 1485 or 1486, which we don't have. You can't complain about the Tudor writers for having written decades later, who also cited sources we don't have, but do the same with a writer from a century later. To continue, Perkin Warbeck, the next impostor, this time claiming to be Edward's brother Richard, could have claimed that the true Edward V died at the Battle of Stoke, or said anything about him. He did nothing in this regard. There's a lot of further stuff in there, but I can't copy and paste the whole chapter into this video. This wouldn't be okay. Thanks for listening to my rant.